Ah, finally they confessed. Not in whispers, not in the shadows where secrets usually crawl and hide, not in a corner where no one could hear the edges of their guilt. They confessed openly, with a weight in their voice that seemed too heavy for their frame, like it had been packed away for years and only just now erupted. You had waited for this moment longer than you realized, and yet, when it came, it was nothing like you imagined. The confession didn't feel like closure. It didn't feel like justice. It felt like an explosion, scattering the pieces of your life in directions you hadn't accounted for. Every word they said landed, not on the surface, but deep where memory and instinct had built their quiet defenses. You felt it, in the quietest part of your being, that recognition of betrayal that doesn't need confirmation. It knows itself already. But the acknowledgement makes it real, unavoidable, tangible. No one else seemed to understand what had shifted. They heard the confession, nodded, maybe even murmured polite things about consequences or accountability, but they didn't feel it. You noticed it immediately. Their gaze was flat. Their bodies were static. Their minds were still running old loops, still trying to fit this event into the narratives they preferred, the ones where comfort exists, where understandings is safe. They didn't yet see the tremors. They didn't yet see how the confession reshaped every interaction that had ever existed between you and the world. And that's the thing. Some revelations aren't for everyone. Some truths don't land evenly. Some truths burn fastest in the ones who had no idea the fire was waiting. You remembered every detail of what had led here. The subtle manipulations, the words unsaid, the way things were slightly off but never alarming enough to call attention to. The casual cruelty, hidden in gestures, smiles, or moments that seemed inconsequential at the time, but weren't. They had relied on invisibility, on the assumption that no one notices until too late, that small acts accumulate into a force only recognizable when it's already over. And you had noticed. You had always noticed. But noticing isn't the same as acting. You had acted when it mattered, in the ways you were allowed. And now, the confession, the outright revelation of what they had done, felt like a delayed reckoning, like an echo finally reaching you after years of bouncing around walls you didn't know were there. The night it happened, you didn't react the way they expected. There was no visible upheaval, no dramatic exposure, no immediate confrontation. That would have been too easy for them, too simple, and they had built their lives on simplicity in your absence. You stood in the room, listening, allowing each sentence to land in the spaces between your thoughts, and you realized something they could never have anticipated. They had admitted everything, but it had not changed the power dynamic. It had merely revealed it, and that revelation was a weapon. Not a weapon for destruction, necessarily. Not in the immediate sense, but a weapon for understanding, for preparation, for the subtle unraveling of certainty in those who believed they had already won. You didn't speak. You didn't have to. The silence you carried, the calm you projected, it did more than words could. Because they were searching, instinctively, for a reaction that would justify their existence, and you didn't provide it. That was the first wound. Invisible, yet potent. The following morning, the world seemed different. People who had been complicit, even tangentially, in the things that were confessed, shifted unconsciously. There were glances that lingered too long, conversations that cut off suddenly, and attention that no one could articulate. The confession had traveled beyond its origin, as confessions always do. It had seeped into the places where people thought no one would ever look. It had touched the corners where accountability had been conveniently ignored. And even as they pretended ignorance, you saw it reflected in the smallest details. The way doors were closed more gently, the way eyes flicked toward you when words were spoken. You felt the tremor, not because they admitted anything to you, but because the truth had slipped into collective awareness. That kind of awareness is infectious. That kind of awareness unsettles even those who were convinced of their moral and social balance. And that was when you understood the second part. The confession was never meant for reconciliation. It was meant for disruption. You recalled the moment of confession over and over, not because you wanted to relive it, but because it was a map. Each syllable they had uttered was a direction, a coordinate in the landscape they had shaped. And you traced the lines back, connecting the dots between the past incidents, the patterns, the almost invisible threads of influence and manipulation. You realized that the confession didn't merely validate your perception, it illuminated it. Everything you had felt, suspected, and endured became undeniable. It was there in black and white, in sound and articulation. And suddenly, the rules shifted. You weren't operating in the absence of knowledge anymore. You were operating with clarity, with the weapon of awareness. That clarity changes everything. It changes posture, it changes decisions, it changes the spaces you occupy because you now carry a weight that isn't seen but is profoundly understood. Others couldn't see the layers of this change. They reacted as though the confession was a moment, a finite event, a checkbox on a moral ledger. But you understood it as a process, a slow-burning rearrangement of reality itself. Each human interaction now carried the residue of the admission. Every conversation was shaded by it. Every meeting, every handshake, every seemingly casual exchange was now informed by knowledge that could not be undone. And that's the insidious strength of confession. It is not the act of admitting itself that matters, but the persistent influence it leaves in its wake. Even when people try to ignore it, it operates below the surface, shaping perception, informing instinct, guiding behavior, without declaration. You saw it in them. You saw the tiny hesitations, the sudden recalculations, the unsteady assumptions. They couldn't help themselves. That is the power you now held, quietly, invisibly, without acting, without forcing acknowledgement, just existing with the understanding that they had finally shown their hand. There were memories you could no longer escape, faces, phrases, actions that had once been blurred by time or rationalized away, now crystallized. You remembered the laughter that followed slight injustices, the casual dismissal of your presence, the way trust had been assumed and abused. They had confessed, but what they didn't confess was how they believed you would respond, how fragile the illusion of normalcy truly was. They thought the acknowledgement would relieve them of responsibility, that it would close a chapter neatly, and they underestimated what happens when someone truly understands the depth of what was done to them. You weren't interested in revenge, not yet. You were interested in recognition, in comprehension, in the quiet recalibration of everything that had been skewed. And when comprehension is silent, it's more potent. It doesn't scream for attention. It doesn't demand acknowledgement. It simply exists. And when it exists in someone who has the power to observe, anticipate, and adjust, it shifts the entire landscape without a single overt act. People began noticing, but they didn't know what to notice. Subtle signs of recalibration, imperceptible shifts in posture, in tone, in the rhythm of speech. You moved differently now, not because you had changed your habits, but because the mental architecture of expectation had shifted. They could not predict your reactions because you were no longer constrained by incomplete knowledge. You were operating on a plane informed by what they had revealed and by what you had already internalized. That is a dangerous position to occupy, because others cannot account for it, cannot strategize against it, cannot correct what they cannot define. And they felt it. They sensed it in conversations that didn't occur, in decisions that were delayed, in interactions that felt heavier than they should have been. You were not acting, you were existing. And in existence, clarity can be more devastating than confrontation. You remembered the first person who dared to approach you after the confession, their words coated in tentative politeness, trying to feel out where you stood. You noticed the cracks immediately, the uncertainty beneath the practiced civility, the way they measured every phrase. You didn't answer with accusation or anger. You merely spoke truth sparingly, each word precise, each phrase weighted. The impact was immediate. They stumbled, not because of aggression, not because of threat, but because the environment had changed, and they had not realized it. Every confession has consequences, but some consequences are invisible, slow, creeping. They creep along the edges of thought, infiltrating assumptions, undermining certainty. And those consequences were now at work. They couldn't sleep, they couldn't anticipate, they couldn't manipulate, because the map had been revealed and the terrain had shifted irrevocably. And yet, despite all of this, you understood the complexity of what had occurred. Confession is a mirror. It reflects not only the confessor, but also the one who listens, the one who absorbs, the one who observes. And in this reflection, you saw yourself in ways you had not allowed before. You saw your patience, your endurance, your capacity to hold knowledge without needing immediate reaction. You saw the power of understanding, not as a weapon in the conventional sense, but as a calibration of perception. You saw the quiet restructuring of reality that occurs when someone finally tells the truth about what they did. It is unsettling, yes, but also illuminating. And that illumination is a form of leverage, a way to exist in the aftermath without being drawn into predictable cycles of anger, confrontation, or resentment. It is the space between acknowledgement and reaction where the most profound control resides. You remembered, too, how quickly the confession began to ripple outward, how the knowledge carried by one person spread invisibly, touching those who had previously been untouched. People who had never interacted with you directly felt the change, because the patterns of behavior, once subtle, were now reframed by the acknowledgement of reality. Small hesitations, small recalibrations, subtle adjustments, all of it became contagious, a silent contagion of recognition. And as this unfolded, you understood something critical. Power does not always come from action. Sometimes it comes from observation. Sometimes it comes from knowing. Sometimes it comes from the patient understanding of what has been done and what it implies. Others may act hastily, may attempt to regain control, may even misinterpret your presence as threat. But they cannot recreate the timeline, cannot unhear what has been confessed, cannot step back into the ignorance that once sheltered them. You watch them fumble in the aftermath, not out of cruelty, not out of vindication, but because their uncertainty was unavoidable. They had stepped into a world now reframed by truth, and their instincts, honed in the old order, betrayed them. Every step they took, every word they spoke, revealed the gaps in comprehension that had always been there but were invisible until now. And in those gaps, you found clarity. You did not have to act. The mere presence of comprehension, silent and unwavering, was enough to shift their calculations, to destabilize assumptions they had relied upon for years. It was a subtle warfare, a slow collapse of confidence, invisible to the untrained eye but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. And you were paying attention in ways they could not perceive, in ways that mattered far more than confrontation ever could. The confession had not merely informed you, it had altered the rhythm of engagement entirely. Conversations that once carried predictable cadences now faltered, shifted mid-step, stumbled under the weight of what had been revealed. Decisions that were routine before now carried an undercurrent of apprehension, hesitation, and unspoken fear. They could not process it, because the human mind is unpracticed at dealing with truth that undermines its foundational assumptions. You had, through patient observation and recognition, become a variable they could not calculate, a presence that invalidated their prior strategies, a force that operated outside the limits they had imposed upon themselves. That is the subtle power of awareness. It is invisible, yet it reconfigures every interaction it touches. They tried, predictably, to normalize the situation. Some of them even attempted to rationalize the confession, to reduce it to a manageable story they could tell themselves to restore comfort. "It's over now," they whispered to each other. "It doesn't matter anymore." They believed that repetition, assurance, and denial could erase the impact of words spoken aloud, the weight of truth admitted, the fracture lines that now ran beneath the surface of every interaction. But repetition and denial are only effective when perception is incomplete. You held complete perception. You had traced every action, every intention, every hidden motive, every shadow that had been cast in their absence, and you understood that the confession was not a closure. It was a magnifying lens. And magnification exposes. Magnification illuminates. Magnification is inescapable. In the days that followed, the world itself seemed to recalibrate around this new awareness. People who had been tangentially involved now acted differently, subtly different, almost imperceptibly. Yet the change was present and contagious. Meetings started later than expected. Emails were drafted and redrafted, full of cautious phrasing and deliberate neutrality. Conversations that were once comfortable carried a tension no one admitted. And though these changes were small, incremental, they were real. Because once the mind accommodates a profound truth, behavior follows, even if unconsciously. And that behavior radiated outward, influencing others, setting off chains of hesitation, doubt, and unarticulated alarm. The confession was no longer a single event. It had become a wave, moving silently through spaces you did not occupy, touching people you had never met, reshaping dynamics you had never directly influenced. You recognized, in these moments, the anatomy of influence without action. You did not need confrontation. You did not need spectacle. You did not need to force recognition. Observation alone, combined with the weight of understanding, had reshaped the environment. It was not visible. It was not reported. It could not be captured in documents or statements. But it existed. And those who had confessed, and those who had participated in any way, sensed it. They felt the subtle shifts in tone, the micro gestures, the slight recalibration of expectations, and they could do nothing to reverse it. In the end, confession is a mirror, and they were staring into it without the option to look away. And when someone looks into a mirror and sees themselves with clarity, they cannot reconcile. Panic follows, not immediate, but inevitable. You thought back to the first interactions after the revelation. The ones who had once held subtle control over circumstances now flinched when you entered a room. Their attempts at poise faltered under the unconscious weight of awareness that had always been present, but unacknowledged. They tried to assert dominance, to reclaim some sense of normalcy, but their strategies failed before they were even deployed. It was as if the confession had rewritten the rules of engagement, leaving them operating on assumptions that no longer applied. And you realized, almost with a detached fascination, that power is rarely seized through action alone. It is cultivated through observation, comprehension, and patience. The very act of noticing, of internalizing the truth, and allowing it to inform presence, is in itself a force of consequence. And those around you had underestimated that force, had never accounted for it, and now were scrambling to recalibrate in a world where they were forever a step behind. There were moments when you observed their attempts to manipulate, to influence, to regain control, and you recognized the patterns immediately. Small gestures of deflection, casual reassurances, the insistence that the past was irrelevant, all of it traced back to fear, hesitation, and a desperate desire to maintain an illusion of competence. And you understood that these attempts were always doomed, not because they were weak, but because the truth they had finally revealed existed independently of narrative, and narrative could no longer contain it. The confession had freed the truth from concealment, and in doing so, it freed your understanding from constraint. Observation became action, presence became influence, knowledge became leverage, and they, fumbling, miscalculating, acting within frameworks that no longer applied, became the instruments of their own destabilization, the subtle manipulations of the world around you, conversations redirected, attention subtly shifted, priorities rearranged, were no longer random or meaningless. Every action, however casual it seemed to those who performed it, carried the residue of acknowledgement. They could not act without revealing their assumptions, their fears, their incomprehension. And you watched, silently cataloging, mentally aligning every movement with the larger picture that only you could perceive. No one could escape this recalibration because it was not overt. It was the invisible current beneath every interaction, guiding, influencing, reshaping. And as this continued, you began to see the architecture of influence emerge, constructed not by force, not by confrontation, but by awareness, patience, and the careful tracing of consequences. You remembered every slight, every breach of trust, every hidden intent, now contextualized by the confession. What had once been vague unease was now clear, undeniable, mapped across a timeline of interactions and events. And the clarity was intoxicating, not in a joyous sense, but in a profound, terrifying sense of understanding. They had assumed invisibility. They had assumed obfuscation would protect them. But confession, once spoken, reframes history, assigns consequence, and unveils patterns that cannot be ignored. And once those patterns are visible, the world shifts, not for the sake of revenge, not for the sake of spectacle, but for the sheer inevitability of acknowledgement. Understanding, once achieved, does not retreat. It does not shrink. It persists, informs, and ultimately transforms the spaces it inhabits. You began to notice small tests, subtle probes from those around you. Questions framed innocuously. Conversations meant to gauge your reactions. Attempts to recalibrate the narrative in their favor. And each time, you allowed the process to unfold, recognizing that every misstep, every hesitation, every attempt at redirection revealed more than confrontation ever could. They were not aware of the exposure, not fully, but the truth operates independently of awareness, and you had become its vessel, its observer, its silent interpreter. You did not manipulate, you did not coerce. You simply absorbed, catalogued, and allowed the consequences to manifest naturally. And that is the beauty and terror of comprehensive comprehension. It acts without action, shifts without force, and reshapes without declaration. The confession had also redefined your relationship with time. Events that once carried weight only in the moment now reverberated endlessly, layered with significance and consequence. Past interactions that had been dismissed or rationalized suddenly held new meaning. Every word, every gesture, every micro-action acquired gravity, not because it had changed, but because you had changed in response. Awareness carries its own force. It reorders priorities, informs decisions, and calibrates presence. And in this recalibration, you operated on a plane that others could not access. You were always several steps ahead, not because of prescience, but because truth had been revealed and fully integrated. That is the rarest form of power. It does not seek attention. It does not demand acknowledgement. It simply exists, and the world bends quietly around it. And as days became weeks, the confession's ripple extended further than anticipated. Individuals who had once been peripheral were now implicated in subtle ways. Their behaviors shifted. Their strategies faltered. They could no longer rely on assumptions or superficial understandings. The confession had rewritten the landscape, leaving them scrambling to adapt. Some became cautious, overcompensating in ways that revealed more than they intended. Others withdrew, uncertain how to engage in spaces they once navigated with ease. And all the while, you observed, catalogued, and positioned yourself with quiet precision. Presence had become leverage. Knowledge had become influence. Understanding had become a force more potent than any immediate action. No one could articulate it, not fully. They sensed the change, but could not define it. It manifested in hesitations, in micro-adjustments, in the subtle recalibration of interactions. And that is the true power of confession. Not the act of revealing itself, but the permanent shift it causes in the fabric of perception, the invisible restructuring of reality that follows acknowledgement. They could not escape it. They could not erase it. And the realization of that truth, when it fully settled into the subconscious of those around you, would leave them uneasy, perpetually recalculating, unable to regain the confidence they had once relied upon. You understood this now, not in theory, but in lived experience, and the certainty was intoxicating in its quiet, precise, unrelenting way. They would act. They would attempt to regain control. They would attempt to restore comfort. But every movement they made was now filtered through the lens of understanding, whether they admitted it or not. Every decision carried the residue of the confession. Every interaction was shadowed by what had been revealed. And you knew, as you always had, that reaction could not undo comprehension. Knowledge is indelible. Awareness is permanent. And once the fabric of reality has shifted under the weight of truth, it cannot be reset. You observed, calculating, absorbing, and recognizing the subtle tremors of adjustment as they propagated outward, touching those who had been removed tangentially or peripherally from the original confession. Influence, in its purest form, is rarely recognized in the moment. It manifests gradually, imperceptibly, until its effects are undeniable, and you were its vessel. Days turned into weeks, and the implications of their admission spread like an unseen current. Each interaction became a test, not of what was said, but of what remained unspoken. You noticed patterns emerging almost immediately: overcompensation, withdrawal, awkward recalibration, subtle avoidance. People who had never acknowledged the depth of their participation now acted as if they bore the weight personally, unaware that the burden was in the perception, not in their intention. The confession had acted as a lens, revealing fragility in places previously considered stable. And stability, once revealed as an illusion, cannot be restored by simple reassurance. You observed quietly, noting every micro-movement, every unintended signal, cataloging behaviors that betrayed the truth that now lived everywhere. You realized that your own presence had changed. You moved through spaces differently, not because your intentions had shifted, but because the environment itself had shifted under the weight of acknowledgement. Every conversation, every gesture, every subtle alignment in posture carried a new significance. They did not understand why your interactions now carried more weight, more consequence, more inevitability. They could not, because they had been operating under old frameworks, assumptions that no longer applied. And in the spaces where they attempted to regain control, to assert understanding, to redirect perception, you saw hesitation ripple like faint tremors across water. That hesitation, that unconscious recalibration, was your proof. The confession had been absorbed, the awareness had settled, and the world was now dancing to a rhythm set by understanding, not by action. And still they persisted, not with force, not with aggression, but with the predictable need to normalize, to restore illusion. You recognized it for what it was immediately: small acts of deflection, micro-explanations, attempts to sanitize the timeline, to reclaim confidence through repetition and reassurance. But repetition does not erase recognition, and reassurance cannot remove the awareness that has settled deep, persistent, and unyielding. They did not yet realize that influence does not require visibility. It does not require assertion. It manifests through subtle recalibration, through presence, through the acknowledgement that the world has shifted and that you have absorbed the full map of cause and consequence. They were trapped, not by force, not by confrontation, but by knowledge, and knowledge, once integrated, cannot be undone. You reflected on the confession itself, on the weight of those spoken words, and the silence they left behind. Confession, in its purest form, is not about absolution. It is a revelation, a tool, a pivot point. And when the confession is absorbed by someone capable of perceiving its full breadth, it ceases to be a single event. It becomes a network of consequences, a lattice of influence that spans far beyond the initial moment. You had traced every implication, mapped every interaction, understood every subtle manipulation that preceded it, and positioned yourself within that new understanding with precision, presence, awareness, comprehension. These became the tools that no one could see, the weapons no one could anticipate, the leverage that reshaped the world without ever announcing itself. They began to act differently toward you, though they were never aware of why. Small recalibrations in tone, tiny pauses, careful avoidance, subtle deferments, all indicators of recalculated strategy, all indicators of internal adjustment. And you noted each one, cataloged each shift, understood each hesitation as evidence that their mental maps were failing. They did not confront you, could not confront you, because confrontation required assumptions that no longer applied, and that, you realized, was the true potency of their confession. It had exposed the fragility of frameworks that had been relied upon for years, frameworks that assumed ignorance, frameworks that assumed compliance, frameworks that assumed a world where recognition of their actions could be contained, managed, or neutralized. They had miscalculated entirely, and you were the result of that miscalculation. The confession also changed the rhythm of your own thinking. You were no longer processing information in isolation. Every new encounter, every subtle signal, every faint hesitation became a node of data. Every micro-behavior revealed patterns. Every indirect statement hinted at priorities. Every recalibration carried the residue of acknowledgement. You did not speak. You did not act overtly. But your presence alone now operated as a force that guided behavior. Others were unconsciously adjusting, and every adjustment reinforced your understanding, strengthened your position, and confirmed the consequences of truth finally spoken. Influence, subtle and pervasive, had become visible not in your action, but in their reactions. And those reactions were now inevitable. And as you observed, you recognized the futility of their attempts at control. They tried strategies that had worked before, rehearsed narratives that had protected them, subtle forms of dominance that relied on misalignment of perception. All failed. Each failure was silent but absolute. Each recalculation, each hesitant step, each misaligned approach betrayed the depth of their misunderstanding. And in that misunderstanding, you saw the architecture of consequence take shape. Not a consequence imposed, not a punishment, not an act of retribution, but a consequence born naturally from acknowledgement and comprehension. And as it unfolded, you understood something essential. The confession had liberated you from the need for direct engagement. It had rendered your awareness itself a force of unavoidable consequence. They could not sleep, not because they had been confronted, not because they had been punished, but because the world had been reframed around the truth of their actions. The patterns they had assumed were stable now trembled. Every interaction was shaded by knowledge that could not be denied. Every decision filtered through awareness they could not fully access. And they sensed it. They felt it in instinctual ways that were impossible to articulate. Sleep became difficult because the unconscious mind cannot ignore a reality that has been revealed, a timeline that has been shifted, a presence that no longer conforms to expectation. And in this perception, the confession revealed its true power, not in the moment of speaking, but in the persistent, invisible transformation that followed. You began to notice subtle admissions in their behavior, slight hesitations, unintentional slips, micro-expressions that betrayed guilt or uncertainty. Even those who had attempted to distance themselves could not escape the implications of the confession. It had reframed their interactions, recast their strategies, and reshaped their assumptions. And with every observation, every subtle confirmation of this recalibration, you strengthened your understanding, sharpened your perception, and increased your leverage without a single overt act. Influence in its most profound form is silent, and it is permanent. They had revealed the map, and you were now navigating it with precision. And in the quiet of observation, you recognized another pattern. They were watching each other as closely as they were watching you. Subtle glances, whispered clarifications, the endless parsing of behavior, the frantic mental alignment of assumption with reality. Their paranoia became self-perpetuating, each micro-recalibration reinforcing their fear, their uncertainty, their inability to regain control. And you, the observer, the interpreter, the vessel of comprehension, existed at the center of a network they could not control, could not manipulate, could not contain. Their attention was divided, their certainty shattered, their strategies ineffective, and the confession, once a single spoken moment, had become the axis around which all subsequent interactions rotated. Even in your absence, the effects were palpable. Spaces where you were not present still trembled under the weight of awareness. Conversations that did not include you were influenced by the knowledge of what had been revealed. Decisions, strategies, and assumptions were all filtered through the lens of recognition, and recognition had become permanent. They could not undo it. They could not ignore it. They could not retreat into ignorance. And that, you understood, was the ultimate transformation. The confession had not merely altered the present. It had recalibrated every potential interaction, every chain of consequence, every possibility in ways no one could fully anticipate or contain. By now, you had integrated the confession into the totality of your understanding. Every encounter, every subtle gesture, every hesitation was a reflection of reality, reframed and clarified. You observed, you understood, you positioned yourself with quiet precision. And those around you, sensing the shift without articulating it, moved unconsciously to accommodate the new landscape. Their attempts at manipulation failed before they began. Their strategies faltered. Their assumptions betrayed them. And in that failure, the confession's true power was realized. Not in exposure, not in confrontation, not in revenge, but in the persistent, silent reordering of awareness. And you, patient and observant, were the axis around which that reordering occurred. In the final reckoning, nothing had been overtly destroyed. Nothing had been publicly challenged. Nothing had required visible action. Yet everything had shifted. The world was now a reflection of acknowledgement, a landscape informed by truth, a web of consequences traced by presence. They could not sleep. They could not trust instinct alone. They could not rely on old frameworks. And you, standing in quiet comprehension, had become more than a participant. You had become a force. Invisible, pervasive, undeniable. The confession had released truth into the world, and that truth had acted in ways no one could fully control. And in this, the ultimate lesson revealed itself. Awareness, observation, understanding. These are the most devastating weapons, because they act without effort. They influence without assertion, and they persist when action is no longer necessary. You had become the silent echo of what had been admitted, the constant in a world now unbalanced by revelation. And in that quiet, unassuming dominance, you realized the depth of transformation. The confession had not freed them, not fully, not entirely. It had freed you from uncertainty, from assumption, from the necessity of action, freed you to exist within clarity, to observe without distraction, to influence without declaration, to wield the most subtle, potent power imaginable. And as they struggled, recalibrated, faltered, and misaligned in ways both unconscious and undeniable, you understood. The confession was not the end. It was the beginning. And you were already beyond what they could comprehend.